A single appointment was enough to shake a seemingly stable world to its core. What began as a routine summons quickly escalated into one of the most harrowing moments the palace had witnessed in years. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and carefully curated public images, a truth was spoken that changed everything. For Catherine, this day marked not just another entry in the calendar, but the beginning of a crisis whose implications extended far beyond personal anxieties. The circumstances initially appeared unremarkable. Polite notice, no indication of urgency, no alarm. Such invitations were commonplace. Yet, upon entering the familiar corridors, an unusual heaviness hung in the air. The usually bustling passageways seemed hushed. Conversations and routines appeared to have slowed to a crawl. Observers later described an atmosphere less reminiscent of a palace than of a place. A quiet tension, as if the building itself knew a turning point was imminent. The room into which Catherine was led was austere, almost clinical. No sumptuous decor, no courtly staging. Prince Louis's examinations had previously been described as purely precautionary, a standardized checkup with no cause for concern. These words were meant to be reassuring, but they didn't hold up to the first glance at the faces of those present. Reserved expressions, carefully chosen pauses, and language that concealed more than it revealed suggested that this was not a trivial matter. Then the terms were spoken precisely and unambiguously. No hints, no euphemisms. The statements carried a weight that left no room for doubt. For Catherine, this meant the abrupt collapse of any carefully maintained composure. Eyewitnesses reported a moment when calm turned into sheer shock. The physical reaction was as violent as it was inevitable. This moment was considered not only a personal shock but also a signal that something of considerable importance had occurred. Immediately afterward, an internal machinery kicked into gear, one that is rarely visible in the palace. Communication channels were restricted, instructions were issued without explanation, and movements were coordinated. The goal was not comfort but control. Information was to be gathered, reactions dampened, and any uncertainty disseminated to the outside world prevented. Catherine was quickly taken out of public view, shielded from prying eyes and questions. Her withdrawal was silent, but unmistakable to those around her. Insiders later described this moment as a rupture that extended far beyond the family directly affected. For what came to light was not merely an individual tragedy, but touched the core of a system built on stability and an immaculate image. The realization that something serious had gone unnoticed, or at least unaddressed, for an extended period cast doubt on internal procedures. How could it have come to this? Who knew what? And since when? As Catherine grappled with this new reality, the palace responded with a conspicuous silence. This silence was not reassuring but unsettling. It left room for speculation and fueled the impression that more was hidden than was officially admitted. Every step, every decision of the past months took on a different weight in retrospect. Flashbacks to public appearances and seemingly innocuous moments acquired a new, oppressive significance. This day thus marked the beginning of a development whose extent could initially only be guessed at. Catherine's emotional turmoil encountered a system that exhibited reflexes of shielding and repression. It was precisely within this field of tension that a story began to unfold, raising questions about responsibility, transparency, and priorities. Was this merely a tragic, isolated incident or a symptom of deeper problems within the institution? In the end, a feeling of uncertainty remained. The certainty that nothing would ever be the same again was intertwined with the question of how the palace would respond to these challenges. Would openness follow, or would there be further silence? And what did this moment truly mean for the future of Prince Louis and the image that was to be projected to the outside world? With the passage of time, a pattern began to emerge that hardly anyone had previously taken seriously. Individual moments, which had gone unnoticed in the daily grind, suddenly appeared in a new light. What had long been considered a childhood quirk or a harmless phase, now seemed in retrospect like a series of overlooked warning signs. For Catherine, This marked the beginning of an agonizing reconstruction of the past months, during which small deviations had accumulated without ever being openly addressed. Subtle abnormalities had been noticed early on. Slight delays, brief periods of exhaustion, behavior that defied easy categorization. However, in the tightly choreographed world of public appearances, there was little room for such observations. Prince Louis was presented as a lively, carefree boy whose spontaneous gestures were celebrated by the public as endearing idiosyncrasies. But behind the scenes, observations piled up that seemed less carefree. At official events, it became increasingly clear how quickly his energy waned. While other children effortlessly guided the audience through programs, he sometimes seemed absent, seeking closeness, withdrawing. To outsiders, this was little more than a fleeting impression, but for those closer to them, it was a recurring pattern. Nevertheless, reassuring explanations dominated. The pressure of the public eye, the harsh glare of the flashbulbs, the unfamiliar surroundings, all of this seemed sufficient explanation. Catherine, however, perceived these signals more intensely. The role demanded constant self-control, yet maternal intuition could not be completely suppressed. She repeatedly asked questions, cautiously but without alarm. The answers followed a familiar pattern. Boys develop differently, she was told. Everyday life is extraordinary. Patience is crucial. These reassurances appeared rational to the outside world, but they merely postponed the doubts. Particularly unsettling was the discrepancy between public portrayal and private perception. Photos and short video clips conveyed normality, while in everyday life, small moments of irritation occurred. Pauses in which Prince Louis did not respond, situations in which routine stalled. None of these, taken individually, were dramatic. But taken together, they painted a picture that could no longer be ignored. Within the palace, such clues were treated with caution. Paying attention to deviations was considered risky, as it could raise questions about stability and future viability. Instead of looking more closely, the focus was on routine. The schedule remained packed. Public appearances were not adjusted. Deviations were not to be noticed, neither by the media nor by the public. With each further observation, however, the internal conflict grew. Catherine began to re-examine earlier recordings, hoping she had been mistaken. But the repeated viewing brought no relief. Instead, it reinforced the impression that clues had been there. The line between concern and certainty became thinner. Even among those close to her, quiet voices began to grow louder. Individual observations were voiced, but they remained vague and cautiously worded. No one wanted to be the one to raise the alarm. In an institution geared toward continuity, caution is easily mistaken for loyalty. Thus, clues remained fragmented, without consequences. This phase was characterized by repression and uncertainty. Every new public engagement intensified the tension between what was shown and what was developing in private. Catherine increasingly found herself caught between two worlds, a staged normality and a growing inner certainty that something fundamental was wrong. In retrospect, this period appears as a missed opportunity. Should the early signs have been interpreted differently, clinging to routines was deemed more important than addressing open questions. These considerations gained weight as the moment approached when doubt could no longer be suppressed. It was precisely here that it began to become clear that silent anxieties would soon erupt into open conflict between personal responsibility and institutional self-protection. With the transition from vague concerns to concrete measures, a phase began characterized by delays, internal tensions, and growing mistrust. Once the initial indications could no longer be ignored, investigations were ordered, officially discreet, but internally accompanied by palpable reticence. Outwardly, everything remained calm, almost motionless. Behind the scenes, however, a power struggle unfolded in which time became the decisive factor. Prince Louis's tests were declared a precautionary measure. The term sounded harmless, almost routine. But the very way these investigations were framed raised doubts. Appointments were postponed, results were delayed, and every inquiry was met with formulaic explanations. The impression arose that the process was being deliberately slowed down, not for medical reasons, but for strategic calculation. Catherine was acutely aware of these delays. What began as an administrative hurdle quickly escalated into an ordeal. Every lost day reinforced the feeling that the child's best interests were not being served. Instead of providing clarity, the focus seemed to be on avoiding unrest. Concern about potential public reactions increasingly took center stage. Within the institution, caution became the guiding principle. Decisions were to be coordinated, risks minimized, and scenarios rehearsed. But this approach came at a price. Medical urgency clashed with political caution. The question of whether faster action was necessary was not openly discussed but postponed. During this period of limbo, the gap widened between the personal need for certainty and the institutional need for control. William found himself in a difficult position. As a father, he was directly affected as the future king, part of a system geared towards stability. Reports from his inner circle indicate that he wavered between trust in existing procedures and growing skepticism. The familiar structures, which had always promised reliability, suddenly seemed sluggish and unapproachable. Nevertheless, the official line remained closed to the outside world. Any irritation was avoided. Charles was also informed, but in a manner that appeared more matter-of-fact than empathetic. The presentation focused on procedures, risks, and potential consequences for the overall picture. Personal dimensions receded into the background. This sober assessment reinforced the impression that not only medical issues were being discussed, but also strategic considerations for the future. At the same time, Camilla gained influence. Her role was not publicly visible, but within the palace she was considered a key voice on sensitive matters. According to reports, she advocated restraint and order, for a controlled handling of information. Emotional reactions were to be avoided, and decisions rationalized. This stance found support among those who viewed any form of uncertainty as a risk. For Catherine, the situation became increasingly critical. The repeated delays no longer seemed random, but systematic. Every attempt to demand further clarification met with resistance. Officially, the message was to remain calm and respect the processes. Unofficially, the feeling grew that institutional logic was being prioritized over personal concerns. This phase marked the transition from concern to open conflict. The contrast between maternal responsibility and Palestinian caution became ever more pronounced. The question was no longer whether action was necessary, but who retained control over that action. With each passing day of uncertainty, the pressure mounted, and the willingness to accept vague promises diminished. At the end of this period, a sobering realization emerged. The investigations had indeed begun, but they were overshadowed by political considerations. The delays had eroded trust and hardened the lines of division. What had started as a medical process had devolved into a power struggle with an uncertain outcome. Would the search for truth ultimately prevail, or would the need for control continue to dictate the course of events? The turning point didn't come with an official announcement, but rather with a breach of internal discipline. What had been controlled, delayed, and shielded for weeks suddenly leaked out. The trigger wasn't a planned move, but a slip-up that abruptly altered the previously tightly controlled information landscape. Within a very short time, the painstakingly maintained facade of calm crumbled. The first clues surfaced unexpectedly. Internal documents, precisely formulated, objectively devoid of emotion, yet highly explosive. They painted a picture that contradicted the previous attempts at reassurance. Preliminary assessments became solid findings, and delays revealed a deliberate strategy. The content left little room for interpretation and made it clear that key insights had been available for some time. A flurry of activity ensued in the palace. Communication channels were reviewed, responsibilities redistributed, and crisis meetings convened. But the damage had been done. The information had escaped the controlled circles and was beginning to take on a life of its own. Every attempt to contain the situation seemed reactive and belated. The hitherto prevailing strategy of silence lost its effectiveness. For Catherine, this development was a double blow. Not only did the published evidence confirm her worst fears, but it also revealed that crucial information had been withheld. The realization that clarity would have been possible had action been taken sooner added further urgency to the situation. The personal crisis transformed into an institutional scandal. The public reaction was swift. Speculation ran rampant, analyses proliferated rapidly, and the demand for explanations increased dramatically. The palace felt compelled to prepare statements without, however, disclosing any concrete details. This reticence increasingly appeared as an admission of guilt. The less that was said, the greater the mistrust became. William came into focus not as an active participant, but as a symbol of a fractured sense of responsibility. The expectation of him demonstrating leadership clashed with the reality of internal dependencies. His reticence was interpreted in various ways, as loyalty to the system or as an inability to stand up to established structures. In any case, it reinforced the impression of a leadership crisis. Charles officially remained aloof. Statements from his inner circle emphasized continuity and stability, yet avoided any substantive discussion. This strategy was calculated but cold. While the public debate was emotionally charged, the official line remained sober and technocratic. This very contrast highlighted the gap between the institution and public expectations. Camilla receded further into the background without losing influence. Her role remained indirect, yet decisions clearly bore her signature. Order, control, and damage control were paramount. The priority was not disclosure, but restoring a functioning state. This approach, however, increasingly drew criticism, as it was perceived as an attempt to stifle debate. It had crossed a line that could no longer be reversed. An internal matter had become a public issue, raising questions about transparency, accountability, and credibility. The strategy of secrecy had failed, and any further delay threatened to permanently damage trust. At the end of this phase came the realization that the truth could no longer be controlled. The breaking of the silence had triggered a chain reaction with unforeseeable consequences. The central question was no longer whether action was necessary, but how profound the repercussions would be. Would this disclosure lead to a change of course, or would the attempt to regain control further exacerbate the crisis? With the final evaluation of the medical findings, the crisis reached a new dimension. What had previously been perceived as a delaying tactic or internal conflict now took on a clear, irreversible dimension. The diagnosis confirmed that this was not a temporary phase, but a serious long-term challenge. The focus thus shifted abruptly from internal power struggles to the consequences for family public life and institutional planning. For Catherine, this confirmation was a moment of profound shock. The hope that the worries might prove unfounded gave way to the certainty that a fundamental change was imminent. Observers described this moment as an emotional turning point, where personal despair merged with the awareness of being part of a larger structure that now had to react. The diagnosis made it clear that future developments remained uncertain and adjustments were unavoidable. Within the family, feelings of guilt and self-recrimination came to the fore. The question of whether earlier warning signs should have been taken more seriously weighed heavily on those around them. William was confronted with the realization that trust in established procedures may have been maintained for too long. His role as a father clashed painfully with his role as a bearer of institutional responsibility. This inner conflict shaped his demeanor and reinforced the impression of a family under enormous pressure. Meanwhile, a period of sober reassessment began at the palace. The diagnosis forced structural considerations that went beyond medical aspects. Public appearances, long-term planning, and the portrayal of stability all had to be readjusted. A distinct coldness emerged in the tone of internal discussions. Emotional dimensions receded behind strategic considerations. The question was no longer what was morally imperative, but what seemed organizationally necessary. Charles adopted a wait-and-see approach. Reports from his inner circle painted a picture of a monarch focused on continuity and avoiding any hasty decisions. This reticence was interpreted in different ways. For some, it was an expression of prudence. For others, a sign of a lack of empathy. In any case, it reinforced the perception that the institution was seeking to protect itself. Miller gained importance during this period. Her position allowed her to influence processes without appearing in public. Decisions were accelerated, responsibilities redistributed, and scenarios examined. The focus shifted to the future and potential adjustments within the family. This created the impression that personal tragedy and strategic planning were in problematic opposition. For Prince Louis himself, the new reality represented a quiet but profound change. The expectations associated with public appearances had to be reconsidered. Instead of symbolism, the focus shifted to care, at least internally. But this care was contingent on it not destabilizing the public image. This was precisely the crux of the conflict. The diagnosis acted as a catalyst, revealing latent tensions. What had previously remained hidden now became clear. A system that wavered between human responsibility and institutional self-assertion. The question of how openly to address the situation divided the organization. Transparency promised trust but carried risks. Silence offered short-term protection but threatened to erode credibility in the long run. At the end of this phase, a fragile reorganization emerged. Roles were adjusted, priorities shifted, without any clear direction being discernible. Uncertainty persisted, as did the question of whether the decisions made truly served the child's best interests or primarily the maintenance of control. The diagnosis had brought certainty but simultaneously created a new uncertainty. How would this reorganization affect the future? And what consequences would it have for the institution's self-image? As the reorganization progressed, the crisis transformed from an internal strain into a fundamental test of resilience. The question of medical care did not recede, but it was overshadowed by a broader debate. How much humanity can a system built on control and continuity tolerate? It was within this tension that the decisive conflict took shape, one that would define the coming years. Catherine increasingly became the focus of this debate. Her actions were driven less by courtly restraint than by the desire to ensure the protection and dignity of Prince Louis. Observers described a marked shift in her priorities. Public expectations diminished in importance, while private decisions gained in urgency. This stance clashed with established procedures geared toward predictability and symbolism. The palace responded with a mixture of adaptation and resistance. On the one hand, measures were taken to stabilize the situation. On the other, the desire to limit the impact of personal decisions remained evident. Institutional logic demanded clear lines, while the individual perspective required flexibility. This tension made every decision a balancing act. William once again found himself caught in the crossfire. His position forced him to balance familial responsibilities with institutional loyalty. This dual role proved increasingly untenable. Public perception began to shift. Reticence was no longer interpreted as strength, but as insecurity. The pressure to take a clear stance intensified. Charles maintained a cautious approach. Stability remained the central guiding principle. This strategy aimed to avoid long-term upheavals, but it increasingly seemed out of touch. In a period of growing demands for transparency, reticence appeared like a relic of bygone practices. The gap between the institution and public expectations widened further. Camilla continued to operate behind the scenes, but her influence remained palpable. Decisions bore a hallmark of order and efficiency. Critics saw this as a lack of empathy, while supporters viewed it as necessary pragmatism. Regardless of the assessment, this approach reinforced the perception that strategic considerations were being prioritized over personal destinies. For Prince Louis, this period meant a gradual shift in daily life. The focus moved from public appearances to individual patronage. This adjustment was necessary, but it also represented a tacit admission that previous expectations could not be maintained. Symbolic value outweighed practical necessity. The long-term consequences of this development are not yet foreseeable. What is clear, however, is that the events have triggered a debate that extends beyond this individual case. Questions of transparency, responsibility, and the relationship between individuals and institutions have moved to the forefront. The crisis has thus become a touchstone for the palace's self-image. At the end of this section, an open outlook remains. The decisions made have changed the fundamentals, but they have not provided any definitive answers. Will the institution adapt and set new priorities, or will it cling to old patterns? And what lessons will be learned from this phase when the next challenge arises? The events surrounding Prince Louis have triggered a chain of developments that extend far beyond a private crisis. Beginning with a seemingly routine summons, a situation developed in which early warning signs were overlooked, investigations were delayed, and decisions were politicized. The breaking of the silence through a leak made it clear that control and secrecy had reached their limits. The subsequent confirmation of the diagnosis forced the family and the institution to reorganize, a process fraught with tension and conflicting interests. Catherine emerged as the driving force, determined to prioritize her child's protection over traditional expectations. William found himself torn between familial responsibility and institutional loyalty, while Charles and Camilla pursued a course of stability and control. These differing approaches exposed fundamental questions about the palace's self-image. The adjustments to Prince Louis's daily life marked a quiet but significant shift. The crisis demonstrated how fragile the balance between humanity and institution can be. It cast doubt on established practices and sparked a debate about transparency and accountability. Whether this experience will lead to lasting change or be treated merely as an exception remains to be seen. What is certain is that trust in familiar procedures has been shaken. How will the palace handle similar situations in the future? Will openness become the new norm, or will control remain the guiding principle? And what long-term impact will this phase have on the public image of the institution?